Her father crouched beside the wash-house stove in their rented place outside Sedalia and set a row of Black Creek stones where the window light could reach them. The stones were smooth from water, dark as cast iron. After the fire burned down that night, he held her hand close to the stones, and she felt it. Warmth rising from something that held no flame. He said, "Not all heat comes from fire, Calla. Some of it comes from patience." She was 9 years old. She filed the lesson away like a button in a jar. Now she was 27, widowed, and standing in a stripped cabin with a hole in the roof where the stovepipe used to be, and the only warmth left in the world was whatever she could remember. Calla Whitcomb had been a wife for 14 months. She had been a widow for 6 days. And in those 6 days, she had learned that grief did not wait for a woman to finish grieving before it handed her the next problem. Elias was dead because a horse had shifted wrong under a load of cedar posts on a ranch fence line 20 miles south of the Canadian River. The post stack had rolled, the horse had reared sideways, and Elias had been caught between the animal's shoulder and a wagon brace. The foreman who brought the news said it was quick. Calla did not believe him because the foreman could not meet her eyes, and men who watched quick deaths did not look away from widows 6 days later. She was 27 years old. She had no children, no parents alive within 1,000 miles, and no brother who had written in 3 years. She had $9 in coin, 2 wool blankets with no holes she could find in daylight, a shovel with a cracked handle wrapped twice in rawhide, 1 canvas wagon cover, a Dutch oven, a tin coffee pot, and a sack of cornmeal that weighed less than a saddle blanket. She did not have a horse. She did not have a stove, because the stove had belonged to the cabin, and the cabin was the part that changed everything. The men came on a Tuesday. 3 riders and a man in a buckboard who had a folded paper he held like it meant something. Roland Vane did not come himself. He sent riders and paper because paper was cheaper than confrontation, and riders were cheaper than lawyers. The foreman, a flat-jawed man named Strunk who smelled of tallow and did not remove his hat, told Calla that the cabin sat on land attached to Vane's grass lease, that Elias's agreement with the previous leaseholder had been informal and unrecorded, and that with Elias dead, the agreement was dead. Calla said Elias had built the walls himself. Strunk said walls did not make a claim. Calla said there was a spring. Strunk said springs belonged to the land, and the land belonged to whoever held the lease, and the lease belonged to Roland Vane. Then Strunk's men took the stovepipe. They pulled it from the roof like a rotten tooth. The joint where pipe met flashing screamed, a sound like a nail dragged across tin, and a column of cold air dropped into the cabin as if the sky had found a hole it had been looking for. Without the pipe, the stove was useless. Smoke would pool at the ceiling and settle into everything. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a box with a hole in the top. Strunk's men also took the door bar and the corner braces from the north wall. They did not take the walls themselves because walls without braces would sag by spring, and by spring Vane wanted to run fence wire across the site and drop a cattle trough where the cabin floor had been. The spring mattered. The widow did not. Calla stood in the yard holding the canvas wagon sheet against her chest because there was nothing else to hold. The wind came from the northwest and carried the smell of dry grass and the faint mineral scent of snow that had not yet fallen. The sky to the north was the color of a bruise. She asked Strunk if she could have the stovepipe back. Strunk looked at the folded paper and said nothing. His silence was his answer, and his answer was that a widow without a roof was not his concern. $9, no horse, no relatives close enough to reach before the weather turned. The road to Mobeetie was 31 miles through open grass with no shelter between the breaks and the first ranch gate. A woman alone on that road in January, carrying a bedroll and a sack of cornmeal, would be found in a draw by March. The Panhandle did not forgive people who moved slowly across open ground in winter. She could not leave because leaving meant walking, and walking meant dying. She could not stay in the cabin because the cabin no longer held heat. And she could not go to Vane because Vane was the reason she was standing in a yard that was no longer hers, holding canvas that was the only thing between her body and a wind that would reach 20 below before the week was out. Abel Trowbridge arrived the next morning. He came on a gray horse that looked older than he did, and he dismounted the way a man dismounts when he already knows what he will find and does not want to find it. Trowbridge was 61 years old, a county stock inspector and former trail boss who had pushed cattle north before the drift fences carved the Panhandle into parcels. He wore a coat made from a wool blanket that had been a coat for so long it had forgotten it was ever a blanket. His face had the color and texture of river clay left in sun. He did not greet Calla. He walked the property. He looked at the cabin first. He pressed his hand against the north wall where the corner braces had been pulled and felt the frame shift under his weight. He looked up at the hole where the stovepipe had been. He knelt and checked the stove, a cast iron box that was now decoration, and straightened up slowly, the way men straighten when their knees have memorized every cold morning of 61 years. Then he walked the yard. He counted the wood. He came back. "You have maybe a cord and a half," Trowbridge said. "Cut and stacked by your husband, I'd wager, and not seasoned long enough to burn clean. You need 6 cords minimum to winter, more like 8 if the wind stays on the north quarter the way it's been blowing." "I know," Calla said. "You have no stovepipe. You have no standing roof for practical purposes, because that frame is going to walk off its footing by February without the braces. You have no team to haul wood even if you could find timber, and the nearest timber worth cutting is in the breaks along the river, 4 miles south, and you would need a wagon and an axe and 2 days of weather that isn't trying to kill you." "I know that too." Trowbridge hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked at her the way a man looks at a horse with a broken leg. Not cruel. Worse than cruel. Practical. "A woman without a stove, a roof, or 6 cords of wood is not wintering," he said. "She is waiting." Calla did not ask him what she was waiting for. She knew the word he had not said. She could feel it in the space between his sentence and his silence, the way she could feel the cold pushing through the gap where the stovepipe used to be. Trowbridge told her she should try for Mobeetie. He said the road was hard but passable if she started at first light and made the Hartwell Ranch gate by dark. He said Nora Bell Cates sometimes ran a wagon that direction for supplies and might take a passenger. He said these things the way a doctor says a man should rest, knowing the man cannot afford to stop working. Calla said nothing. She was looking south, past the broken cabin, past the yard where Strunk's boot prints were still pressed into the frozen mud, toward a low swale where the ground dropped toward a cut bank that faced the winter sun. Trowbridge followed her gaze and found nothing worth looking at. A swale. A cut bank. Bare ground where the wind had scoured the snow thin and the grass lay flat as if something heavy had pressed it down. "You're not hearing me," Trowbridge said. "I hear you fine," Calla said. "I'm looking at something." Trowbridge left. He did not offer to take her to Mobeetie. He did not leave food or money or advice beyond the obvious. He had done what stock inspectors did. He had inspected, assessed, and recorded the loss. The loss, in this case, was a woman who would not be wintering. Calla tried the cabin first because trying the cabin was what a reasonable person would do, and Calla was not yet desperate enough to stop being reasonable. She nailed loose boards across the stove pipe hole. The wind came through the gaps between the boards and turned the cabin into a whistle. She stuffed rags into the gaps. The rags held for an hour. Then the wind pushed them through, like fingers poking through wet paper. She lit a fire in the stove anyway, with the pipe hole open, and the smoke climbed to the ceiling, pooled there in a gray layer, and settled over everything like a wool blanket made of ash. Her eyes burned. She coughed until her ribs ached. She put the fire out. She tried a lean-to against the south wall. She drove stakes and stretched the canvas wagon sheet from the wall to the ground, weighted the bottom edge with stones, and crawled underneath. The wind hit the canvas like a hand slapping a drum. The stakes held for 40 minutes. Then the canvas caught a gust that came from under the wall. The frame had shifted enough to let wind through the foundation gap, and the whole lean-to tore free, the canvas snapping across the yard like a shot animal thrashing. She stacked sod against the cabin's north wall. She cut frozen blocks from the yard with the cracked shovel, carried them to the wall, and stacked them 3 courses high. The sod was heavy and awkward, and her arms shook with the weight of it. The wall held for a day. Then the frame shifted again. The missing braces had turned the north wall into a hinge, and the sod slid sideways, taking a section of clapboard with it. The cabin groaned. Something inside fell. Calla did not go in to see what. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Each one louder and more public than the last because sound carried across flat ground, and the Panhandle was very flat and very quiet, and a woman fighting a canvas sheet in the wind was a story that traveled faster than she could. It was the afternoon of the second day after Trowbridge's visit when Calla walked to the cut bank. She walked there because she had run out of reasonable ideas, and because the cut bank was the only place on the property where the wind did not hit her face. The swale dropped 4 feet below the level of the yard, and the cut bank rose another 3 feet on the south-facing side. And when Calla stood at the bottom of the swale with the cut bank at her back, the wind passed over her head like water over a river stone. The ground at the base of the cut bank was different. The snow was thin here. The wind scoured it away. And the winter sun, low and angled from the south, hit the bank for 3 hours in the middle of the day. The bank was studded with dark river stones, black and rust-colored, half buried in clay. Some of them were the size of a man's fist. Some were the size of a bread loaf. Calla knelt and put her hand on one of the dark stones. It was warm, not hot, not anything a person would call comfortable, but warmer than the air, warmer than the frozen ground beside it, warmer than anything she had touched since Strunk's men had pulled the stovepipe and let winter into her cabin. The stone had been sitting in 3 hours of winter sun, and it had held the heat the way a cast-iron skillet holds heat after the fire dies. She sat back on her heels and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. Hope was too large and too clean a word for what she felt. It was more like recognition, the feeling of seeing something she had seen before, in a different place, in a different life. Her father had been a stonemason, not a successful one. He had moved from job to job across Missouri and eastern Kansas, building walls and chimneys and foundations for people who paid late or not at all. But he had understood stone the way some men understood horses, not through study, but through handling. He could hold a rock and tell you whether it would split clean or shatter. He could press his palm against a chimney and tell you whether the mortar was cured. When Calla was 9 years old, her father had set a row of dark creek stones beside the wash-house stove in their rented place outside Sedalia. The stones were black, pulled from a creek bed, smooth from water. He set them where the sun hit them through the window and where the stove heat reached them at night. When the fire burned down, the stones stayed warm for hours. Her father had held her hand near the stones after the fire died and said, "Not all heat comes from flame, Calla. Some of it comes from patience." She had not thought about those stones in years. She thought about them now. The design came to her not as a plan, but as a series of problems that each had one answer. The wind was the killer. Not the cold alone. Cold could be endured. fought with blankets and fire and movement, but wind stole heat faster than any flame could replace it. A person in still air at 10 below zero could survive with fire and shelter. A person in 30-mile wind at 0 degrees would freeze because the wind stripped warmth from skin, from walls, from fire itself. The wind made everything colder than the thermometer said. So the first answer was, get below the wind. A trench, not a cellar, not a room, a trench, long enough to lie in, deep enough to stand below the wind line, narrow enough to hold warmth close. Dig into the swale where the ground was already lower than the prairie surface. The second problem was heat. She had no stovepipe, which meant no stove, which meant no fire larger than a coal pan. A coal pan would keep her hands alive, but not her body. So the heat had to come from somewhere else. The dark stones in the cut bank had absorbed winter sun and held warmth after sunset. If she lined the north wall of the trench with those stones, the wall that faced south, the wall that caught the low winter sun, the stones would collect heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. The third problem was the roof. Any roof that rose above the prairie surface would catch wind. Wind would pry at it, lift it, rip it away. She had already lost one canvas shelter to wind, so the roof had to be flush with the ground, flat, invisible. Poles laid across the trench, brush piled on top, canvas over the brush, sod over the canvas. From 10 feet away, the trench would look like a low hump in the prairie. The wind would pass over it like it passed over every other hump in the grass. The fourth problem was air. A sealed trench would suffocate her. A coal pan in a sealed space would fill the air with poison. So she needed a vent, small, angled away from the wind, closable in the worst gusts. And the entrance had to be narrow and low, angled to the south so the north wind could not pour in. She did not draw the design. She did not write it down. She held it in her head the way her father had held the shape of a chimney, not as a picture, but as a sequence of actions. Dig, line, roof, seal, vent. Each step made the next one possible. The trench would be 8 feet long, 3 feet wide at the floor, 4.5 feet deep, the north wall lined with dark river stones. The south lip left low enough to admit winter sun when the roof hatch was cracked open at midday. The floor sloped slightly toward a shallow drain notch at the south end, so meltwater and condensation would run out instead of pooling where she slept. The entrance would be a narrow crawl gap at the southwest corner, angled away from the prevailing wind. She had earth. She had sod. She had stones. She had one canvas sheet, one cracked shovel, and 2 hands that had not yet stopped working. It was not a plan born of confidence. It was a plan born of the fact that every other plan had already failed, and this one used the only resources she had left, the ground beneath her feet, and the memory of a dead man's lesson about patient heat. Nora Bell Cates came the next morning. Nora Bell was 32, a ranch cook who lived 7 miles northeast on a spread that employed her for her biscuits and tolerated her for her opinions. She was not Calla's friend. Distance and the Panhandle's emptiness had made them neighbors by definition, but not by habit. They had spoken maybe a dozen times in 14 months, always at the supply point near Mobeetie, always briefly, always about prices or weather, or the small currency of women's talk in a place where women were outnumbered and overlooked. Nora Bell came because Trowbridge had told her about the cabin, and because Nora Bell was the kind of woman who checked on people not out of warmth, but out of a need to confirm that her estimation of the world was correct. She expected to find Calla packing or crying or sitting in the ruined cabin staring at the stove. She found Calla in the swale, standing in a trench that was 2 feet deep, swinging the cracked shovel into frozen clay. Nora Bell stood at the edge of the swale and watched for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, What are you doing? Digging, Calla said. She did not stop. I can see that. What I am asking is why you are digging a hole in frozen ground 2 days before a norther when you should be begging a ride to Mobidi. Calla straightened. Her back ached. Her hands were raw inside her gloves, and the rawhide wrap on the shovel handle had worked loose and was cutting into the web between her thumb and forefinger. She had been digging since first light and had moved enough frozen earth to fill a wheelbarrow. It was not enough. She needed to move 10 times that much. I am building a shelter, Calla said. Nora Bell looked at the trench. It was a gash in the earth, 2 feet deep, and barely long enough for a person to lie in. It looked like nothing. It looked like the beginning of a grave. You are putting your strength where your grave goes, Nora Bell said. It's not a grave. It looks like a grave. A grave is 6 feet deep and doesn't need a roof. This is 4.5 feet deep and does. Nora Bell crossed her arms. The wind caught her bonnet strings and whipped them against her jaw. Calla, frozen ground breaks tools. Underground spaces flood. Smoke pools in holes. Cold air settles in low places. Every dugout I have ever seen was dark, wet, and miserable, and those were dug by men with teams and weeks of time and actual timber for the roof. You have a cracked shovel in 2 days. I know what I have. Then you know this is not going to work. Calla bent and lit the small coal pan she had placed near the trench mouth. She had carried a few embers from the cabin's last fire in the Dutch oven, nursing them like something alive. The coals glowed. Calla tore a strip from a flour sack, held it near the entrance of the trench, and let go. The strip drifted, not into the trench, but outward, pulled by the slight draft that moved from the closed north end toward the open south. Air flowed through the trench the way water flows through a tilted pipe, in at the top, along the floor, out at the low end. See that? Calla said. I see a strip of cloth blowing in the wind. The wind is blowing north. That cloth moves south. The trench pulls its own air. Smoke will not pool. It will draft out. Nora Bell stared at the cloth strip lying in the frozen grass. She did not have an answer for what she had seen, and not having an answer made her afraid, and being afraid made her angry. You will freeze in a hole in the ground, Nora Bell said, and when they find you in the spring, they will say you lost your mind after Elias died, and they will be right. She turned and walked back toward her wagon. Halfway there she stopped and set a bundle on the ground without looking back. It was a sack of dried beans and a twist of salt pork wrapped in brown paper. Then she climbed up and drove away. Calla watched her go. Then she picked up the shovel and went back to digging. The word spread the way words spread on open ground, carried by riders, repeated at supply points, passed from ranch hand to ranch hand like a coin worn smooth by too many pockets. Widow Whitcomb is digging her own grave. The phrase was born at the supply room near Mobidi, spoken first by a man who had heard it from a man who had ridden past the swale and seen Calla standing waist deep in a trench, throwing frozen clay over the edge. By the time the phrase reached the second telling, it had become a verdict. By the third, it was a joke. A ranch hand named Kessler rode past the swale, stopped his horse, and watched Calla work for 5 minutes. He did not speak to her. He rode on and told the next rider he passed that the Whitcomb widow was carving a coffin-shaped hole in the hard pan and stacking sod like a woman building a wall around her own madness. The laughter was not vicious. That was the worst part. It was the kind of laughter that comes from people who believe they are watching someone do something sad and pointless. The laughter of pity dressed as humor. The laughter that says, we cannot help her, so we might as well find her entertaining. Calla heard about the phrase 3 days later, when a supply rider delivered a sack of cornmeal she had paid for with two of her $9. 7 remaining now, and the cornmeal would last 12 days if she ate once daily, and mentioned that folks in Mobetti were talking about her. She did not ask what they were saying. She already knew. She could feel it in the way the rider had looked at the trench, which was now 3.5 feet deep and lined on the north wall with 14 dark river stones she had carried from the cut bank, each one the size of a bread loaf, each one set with its darkest face, angled toward the south, where the winter sun would reach it. The trench did not look like a shelter. She knew that. It looked like a wound in the earth, a raw gash with clay walls and a floor of packed dirt, and a row of black stones set into one side like teeth in a jaw. To a person riding past at a distance, it looked wrong. It looked like grief made physical, a woman so undone by loss that she had begun to bury herself before the cold could do it for her. Calla did not explain. Explanation required energy, and energy was a resource she could not waste. Every word she spent defending the trench was a word she did not spend digging, and digging was the only argument that mattered now. Roland Vane came on the 4th day. He came with 2 riders and sat his horse at the top of the swale and looked down at the trench the way a man looks at a stain on his floor. He did not dismount at first. He wanted Calla to see him up there, above her, mounted, looking down. He wanted the geometry to say what his words would confirm. Vane was 48 years old. He had come to the Panhandle with borrowed money and a talent for acquiring things that other people had already paid for. His grass lease covered 11 sections of state land along the Canadian River breaks, land that he held through a combination of legal filings, political friendships, and the kind of fencing that the state legislature had been arguing about for 3 years. The fences blocked access to water. They enclosed public school lands that were supposed to be open. They trapped cattle during storms and turned drift into death. None of this troubled Vane because Vane measured trouble in dollars, and his dollars were increasing. Calla's dead husband had been a minor inconvenience, a man with an informal agreement and a cabin near a spring. The spring was the only part that mattered. Vane needed it for his stock, and a widow with no legal standing was easier to remove than a man with a shovel and a temper. But Calla was not removing herself. She was digging in. Vane dismounted. He walked to the edge of the trench and looked down at Calla, who was on her knees pressing a dark stone into the clay of the north wall. Her hands were bleeding through her gloves. The shovel lay beside her with its handle re-wrapped and the blade caked in frozen earth. "I was told you would be gone by now," Vane said. "You were told wrong." "This is lease land, Mrs. Whitcomb. Your husband's arrangement ended when he did. I have the paper and I have the patience, but I would rather not use either." Calla pressed the stone into the wall. It held. She reached for the next one. Vane stepped closer. He put his boot on the south lip of the trench, the low edge she had carefully shaped to admit sunlight, and pressed down. The frozen sod crumbled under his weight. A section of the lip collapsed inward, showering dirt onto the trench floor and knocking one of the newly set stones loose. "You cannot live under dirt and call it a house," Vane said. He said it the way a man says something he wants repeated. He said it for the riders behind him so they would carry the words back to Mobetti, so the phrase would join the other phrase, so Widow Whitcomb's grave would become, "You cannot live under dirt and call it a house," and the verdict would harden into fact. Calla did not answer him. She did not look at his boot or the collapsed lip or the stone that had fallen from the wall. She waited. Vane watched her wait and found nothing in her silence to push against, which frustrated him more than argument would have. He mounted and rode north with his men. The sound of their horses faded into the wind. Calla climbed out of the trench, cut fresh sod from the prairie with the cracked shovel, and rebuilt the south lip. She made it lower this time, tighter. She pressed the sod into place with her knees and packed earth behind it with her fists. The new lip was 2 inches lower than the old one, which meant more sunlight would reach the stone wall during the 3 hours of midday when the sun was at its lowest angle. Vane had come to frighten her. Instead, he had shown her that the lip needed to be lower. His boot had done what her caution had prevented. It had broken a thing that needed to be broken so she could build it better. She set the loose stone back into the wall and pressed it deeper than before. $7 left. The wind had shifted. It came from the north now with a constancy that meant the air behind it was cold, and the air behind that was colder. The sky to the north had changed color. It was no longer the bruise purple of a distant front. It was blue-black, the color of deep water, the color of something that had weight and was moving. The front was coming. She could not know exactly when. No one on the Panhandle could predict the hour a norther would arrive, only that it would arrive, and that when it came, it would come fast. Temperatures could drop 40 degrees in an hour. Cattle would turn their backs to the wind and walk until they hit wire or water or the edge of the world. Calla looked at the trench, 3.5 feet deep, 14 stones set, no roof poles, no brush, no sod cap. The trench was a beginning, not a shelter. It was a wound in the earth that promised nothing except that it existed. She picked up the shovel. The handle bit into the raw place on her palm. The wind pressed against her back. Somewhere to the north, behind that blue-black wall of sky, the Arctic was emptying itself onto the plains, and everything it touched would stop. Calla swung the shovel into the frozen ground and felt the shock travel up through her wrists, through her forearms, into her shoulders, into her teeth. She had 48 hours, maybe less. If you have ever had someone look at your work and tell you it was a waste of time, tell us about it in the comments. Because what happens next in this story might change how you think about the people who doubt you. The trench was 3.5 feet deep. It needed to be 4.5. The wall held 14 stones. It needed 30. The roof was nothing. It needed to be everything. She swung again. She found the first roof pole at the river breaks. The Canadian river breaks were 4 miles south, a ragged seam where the flat prairie tore open and dropped into a tangle of red clay, cedar scrub, and dry creek channels that fed the river when the rain came and fed nothing when it did not. The breaks were where the Panhandle hid its timber, twisted cedar, cottonwood along the water, hackberry in the draws. It was also where men like Merritt Voss spent their time, because the breaks held sign when the flats held nothing, and sign was what Merritt read the way other men read newspapers. Calla did not meet Merritt at the breaks. She met him at her trench. She had walked to the breaks before dawn, found a dead cedar with a trunk she could drag, and spent 3 hours hauling it back to the swale with a rope looped over her shoulder and the trunk bouncing behind her across frozen grass. The cedar was 12 feet long and crooked, but the first 6 feet were straight enough to span the trench width with overhang on both sides. She needed 6 poles. She had one. Her shoulders burned and her boots had rubbed raw spots on both heels, and when she dropped the cedar beside the trench and sat on the cold ground to rest, she saw a man standing at the top of the swale watching her. He was on foot. That was the first thing she noticed. No horse, which meant he had been walking the breaks on purpose, not riding through. He carried a long rifle in a canvas sleeve and wore a coat made of something that had once been an animal and was now just weight and warmth. His face was brown and creased, and his beard was gray and cut short in the way of men who trimmed with a knife rather than scissors. He was 56 years old, though he looked older and moved younger. Merritt Voss had been a buffalo hunter in the years when buffalo still darkened the grass near adobe walls. He had hauled hides by the wagon load to Dodge City and spent the money on ammunition and flour and done it again until the herds thinned and the hunters scattered and the Panhandle filled with cattle and wire. He had stayed because he knew the breaks, and the breaks were the only part of the Panhandle that interested him. He tracked for ranches now, finding strayed stock, reading weather sign, mapping water, and he lived in a series of line camps and dugouts that he maintained the way a man maintains friendships, visiting each one in turn and leaving them better than he found them. He had come to the swale because he had seen boot tracks heading north from the breaks dragging something heavy, and boot tracks dragging heavy things in January were worth following. He stood at the edge and looked down at the trench. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the depth. 4 feet now, Calla had dug another 6 inches since dawn the day before. And the dark stones set into the north wall, 22 of them now, each one angled with its broadest face toward the south. He looked at the cedar pole lying beside the trench. He looked at the south lip, low and tight, rebuilt after Vane's boot. Then he looked at Calla. "Who told you to face the stones south?" he asked. Calla stood up. Her legs were stiff, and her lower back had a knot in it that felt like a fist pressed against her spine. "Nobody told me. The sun is south. The stones are dark. Dark things hold heat." "Who told you to keep the lip low?" "The wind told me. Tore my lean-to off the cabin wall. Anything that stands up catches wind. Anything flush gets passed over." Merritt walked down into the swale. He moved carefully, placing his feet the way a man places feet when he respects the ground he is walking on. He crouched at the trench edge and ran his hand along the top course of stones. He pressed his palm flat against the largest one, a black river stone the size of a Dutch oven lid, and held it there. "It's warm," he said, not surprised, confirming. 3 hours of sun," Calla said. "It'll hold heat past dark, not much, but some." Merritt looked at the south lip again. He looked at the angle of the winter sun, which was low enough that it would hit the stone wall through the gap between the lip and any roof she built, but only during the middle hours of the day. He looked at the entrance gap she had started to shape at the southwest corner, a narrow crawl space angled away from the north wind. "Why is the entrance on the southwest?" he asked. "Because the wind comes from the north. If the entrance faced north, the wind would pour in like water down a pipe. Southwest means the wind has to turn a corner to find the opening, and wind does not like corners." Merritt stood. He looked at Calla the way a man looks at a tool he had not expected to find sharp. "You need more poles," he said. "I know. I need 5 more. The breaks have dead cedar, but it takes 3 hours to drag one back, and I have maybe 30 hours before that sky opens." Merritt looked north. The blue-black wall had thickened overnight and now covered a quarter of the sky. It did not look like weather. It looked like geography, a new landform pressing south, solid and patient and heavy with cold. "I have a mule in a draw 2 miles east," Merritt said. "She is ugly and slow, and she hates cedar. I will bring her." He did not ask if Calla wanted help. He did not offer charity or sympathy or advice. He told her a fact about a mule and walked east. Calla watched him go and felt the knot in her back loosen by a degree, not because the work had gotten easier, but because for the first time in 10 days, someone had looked at her trench and seen a shelter instead of a grave. Merritt came back with the mule before noon. The mule was exactly as described, short-legged, wall-eyed, and hostile to cedar. But she could drag 2 poles at once, and by late afternoon they had 6 poles laid across the trench on the frozen ground beside it. Merritt cut them to length with a hand axe he carried in his bedroll, trimming the crooked ends and notching the bark where the poles would rest on the trench edges so they would not roll. They worked without much talk. Merritt was not a man who filled silence with sound, and Calla had spent 10 days learning that silence was cheaper than conversation. But between the hauling and the cutting and the fitting, Merritt taught. The first lesson was wind. He pulled a handful of dead grass from the prairie and held it at arm's length, then released it. The grass blew south-southeast. He did it again an hour later. The grass blew due south. He did it a third time as the light began to fade. The grass blew south, southwest. Wind walks before a norther, he said. It circles. Right now it is circling from the north through the east, looking for the angle it likes. When it finds the angle, it locks. After it locks, you have maybe 6 hours before the front wall hits. When the grass stops circling and blows straight south, you seal the roof and get below. The second lesson was stone setting. He climbed into the trench and examined the stones Calla had placed. Most of them were set flat against the wall, their faces flush with the clay. Merritt shook his head. Tilt them, he said. He pulled one stone free and reset it with the top edge leaning slightly inward, away from the wall so the face angled up and toward the south lip. You want the sun to hit the face, not the edge. A flat stone catches light for the hours the sun is level with it. A tilted stone catches light from the minute the sun clears the lip until the minute it drops below. You get more hours of heat from the same stone. He showed her something else. The tilted stone shed condensation, moisture that formed on the face, from breath, from temperature change, from damp earth, would run down the tilted surface and drip onto the trench floor instead of pooling against the wall and freezing there. Frozen condensation on the stone face would block the sun. A tilted shedding stone stayed clear. Calla retilted every stone. 22 stones. It took an hour and her fingers bled through the gloves, but when she finished, the wall looked different. It looked deliberate. It looked like something a person had built with a reason behind every angle. The third lesson was air. Merritt took his knife and cut a hole the size of a man's fist through the sod at the north end of the trench, near the bottom. He shaped a plug from a dense sod block, fitted it into the hole, and pushed it in and out to show how it moved. Warmth without breath kills faster than cold, he said. A coal pan in a sealed hole will put you to sleep and you will not wake up. This vent pulls bad air out. You keep it open when you burn anything, coal, tallow, grass, anything. You close it only when the wind drives snow straight through it, and then you open it again as soon as the gust passes. If you feel your head go thick, open the vent. If you feel sleepy when you should not be sleepy, open the vent. If you're not sure, open the vent. And if the wind blows snow through the vent, punch it clear with the shovel handle. Keep the shovel inside. If the vent blocks and you cannot clear it, open the entrance and let the cold in. Cold is better than dead. The lessons were not charity. They were the currency of a man who recognized competence and responded to it with precision. Merritt did not teach Calla because she was a widow or because she was desperate. He taught her because she had already built most of the trench alone, because her design was sound, and because the things she did not know were the things that would kill her if no one said them. Setbacks came in clusters. The first roof pole snapped when they laid it across the trench. The cedar had a hidden crack where rot had worked into the heartwood, and when Merritt and Calla lowered it into position, the weight of the pole plus the downward pressure of their arms found the crack and split it. The sound was sharp and final, a rifle shot in the quiet of the swale. The pole broke into 2 pieces, neither long enough to span the trench. Calla stood looking at the broken wood and felt something inside her chest tighten like a rope pulled too fast. They used the pieces as cross-bracing and went back to the brakes for another pole. That cost 3 hours. The sky was darker when they returned. The second setback came from a steer. A rancher's stock had drifted south ahead of the building wind, and a young longhorn, confused, thirsty, following the scent of the spring, wandered into the swale and walked across the trench. Its hoof punched through the east corner where the sod wall was thinnest, collapsing a section 2 feet wide and sending a cascade of frozen clay onto the trench floor. The steer bellowed and thrashed and kicked more earth loose before it scrambled out and ran south. Calla spent an hour rebuilding the corner with fresh sod, packing it tighter, cutting the blocks thicker. The third setback was vain. Calla needed cedar poles, and the nearest supply beyond the breaks was the ranch supply point where Vane's foreman, Strunk, controlled the inventory. She walked 7 miles to ask if she could buy 2 cedar fence posts, not for free, for money. She had $7. Posts cost $1.50 each. Strunk said no. He did not say why. He did not have to. His refusal was Vane's refusal, and Vane's refusal was the continuation of a strategy that required Calla to leave or die, because either outcome freed the spring. Calla walked 7 miles back in the dark. When she reached the swale, she found a bundle of willow rods and a tin of lard sitting on the ground near the trench. There was no note. There was no person. But the wagon tracks in the frozen mud led northeast toward the ranch where Nora Bell Cates cooked biscuits and kept opinions. The willow rods were not cedar. They were thinner, weaker, and they bent under weight. But they could be lashed together in bundles and laid across the cedar poles as cross pieces, and the lard could be rubbed into the canvas to make it shed water instead of absorbing it. Nora Bell had given help the way Nora Bell did everything, practically, anonymously, and without any suggestion that it meant she believed the trench would work. Merritt arrived again at dawn. He had spent the night at a line camp to the east and brought back a coil of rope and a piece of salvaged stovepipe the length of his forearm. The stovepipe was dented and blackened, but it was metal, and metal conducted heat better than sod. He fitted it into the rear vent hole and angled it downward so snow could not accumulate inside it. "Where did you get that?" Calla asked. "Line camp east of the breaks. The old hunter who used it is dead. He does not need his pipe." By nightfall, the roof was on. 6 cedar poles spanning the trench, willow bundles lashed across the poles, canvas stretched over the willow, rubbed with lard, brush piled on the canvas. Sod blocks laid over the brush, fitted tight, pressed down until the roof was a flat, low hump that rose less than a foot above the prairie surface. From 20 feet away, the trench was invisible. The wind passed over it and did not catch. The entrance was a crawl gap barely wide enough for shoulders, angled southwest, with a sod block that could be pulled in behind a person like a door. The rear vent was the salvaged stovepipe, angled down, with Merritt's sod plug fitted inside it. The south lip had a narrow hatch, 2 sod blocks that could be lifted during midday to let sun hit the stone wall, then replaced and sealed before dark. 28 dark stones lined the north wall, each one tilted inward, each one catching the low winter sun during the 3 hours it cleared the south lip. The floor was packed earth, sloped toward a shallow drain notch at the south end. 2 blankets lay on the floor. The Dutch oven held a bed of coals. The tin coffee pot held water from the spring. The trench was built. It was not comfortable, not warm, not anything that resembled a home. It was a hole in the earth with a stone wall and a sod roof, and a crawl entrance that smelled of clay and lard, and the faint smoke of coals kept barely alive. But it was below the wind. Abel Trowbridge came back. He came because he had heard about the trench from Kessler, the ranch hand who had watched Calla dig, and because Trowbridge was the kind of man who needed to confirm his own verdicts. He had told Calla she was waiting to die. He needed to see if he was right. He lowered himself into the swale with the careful movements of a man whose knees remembered every winter he had lived through. He walked around the trench, or rather, around the low hump where the trench used to be visible, because the roof was flush now and covered in a thin crust of blown snow, and the only sign that anything existed below the surface was the crawl entrance and the faint smudge of warmth rising from the rear vent. Trowbridge crouched at the entrance and looked in. He saw the stone wall, the coals in the Dutch oven, the blankets on the sloped floor. He felt the air coming out of the entrance, not warm, but not the killing cold of the open prairie. The trench held its heat the way a cast-iron pot holds heat, slowly, reluctantly, but with a stubbornness that outlasted flame. "It's not enough," Trowbridge said. He said it to Merritt, who stood nearby cleaning his rifle. Trowbridge did not say it to Calla because he had already decided that Calla was not the person to argue with. She would not be persuaded. She could only be proven wrong, and the storm had not yet arrived to do the proving. "Early calm proves nothing," Trowbridge said. "A dugout in fair weather's just a hole. A dugout in a norther is a test, and the test has not come. When the wind hits 30 miles an hour and the snow drives horizontal and you cannot see your hand in front of your face, that hole will fill with drift, or the roof will lift, or the vent will choke, and she will die underground the way she would have died above it, except slower." Merritt said nothing. He finished cleaning the rifle barrel and slid it back into the canvas sleeve. "You disagree," Trowbridge said. "I've seen men die in frame houses, and I've seen men live in snow caves," Merritt said. "The house does not decide. The person decides. The house just tells you whether the person was thinking when they built it." Trowbridge looked at the trench again. He looked at the south lip, low, tight, angled to catch sun. He looked at the vent, the stovepipe poking from the sod like a finger pointing at the sky. He looked at the entrance, narrow, southwest facing, blocked by a sod plug. He did not concede, but he stayed longer than a man stays when he is certain of his verdict. Merritt tested the trench the way he tested everything, with his hands and with patience. He hung a strip of damp cloth near the entrance and another strip near the stone wall. Then he sat outside the trench and waited. After 20 minutes, he checked the strips. The entrance strip was stiff. The wall strip was still pliable, not soft, not warm, but flexible enough that the fabric bent when he pinched it. The difference was slight, but the difference was real. The stone wall was releasing stored heat from the afternoon sun, and that heat was enough to keep the air near the wall above the freezing point of moisture in cloth. "Not a stove," Merritt said, "but not a grave either." He checked the vent by holding a twig of dried sage near the stovepipe opening. The smoke drifted outward, pulled by the natural draft Calla had demonstrated to Nora Bell 3 days earlier. Air moved through the trench from the entrance to the vent, slow and steady, exchanging breath for cold. The exchange was a cost. Every breath of fresh air carried some warmth out, but the cost was less than the cost of suffocating. Merritt prepared to leave. He needed to check a line camp 12 miles east where a rancher's supplies were cached against the storm. He packed his rifle, shouldered his bedroll, and looked at the sky. "That wall is going to move tonight," he said. He meant the weather. The blue-black mass to the north now covered half the sky, and its leading edge had a ragged, torn look, like cloth ripping along a seam. "I will be back before full dark tomorrow. If it hits before I'm back, seal the roof, pull the plug, and get below. Do not come out for anyone. Do not open the entrance for anything less than the vent choking." Calla nodded. "And keep the shovel inside," he said. If the entrance drifts shut, you dig out, not up, out. Dig toward the southwest and keep digging until you feel wind. He left. The mule followed him east. The swale was quiet. Calla sat beside the trench and watched the sky. The sun was 2 hours from setting, and the air was still. The stillness was wrong. The Panhandle was never still in January. The wind was as constant as daylight, a fact of the land that you stopped noticing, the way you stopped noticing the taste of water. When the wind stopped, it meant the atmosphere was holding its breath. It meant the thing coming from the north was large enough to reorganize the air in front of it, pressing the local wind flat, creating a pocket of silence that would collapse when the front arrived. Calla went into the trench. She checked the coals. She checked the vent. She counted the stones, 28, each one tilted, each one still carrying the last of the afternoon's warmth. She pulled the sod plug into the entrance behind her and pressed it tight. The silence lasted another hour. Then the wind came. It did not arrive as wind. It arrived as sound. The first thing Calla heard was a roar from the north that sounded like water. Not a river, but an ocean. A wall of moving air hitting the prairie the way a wave hits a seawall, and the prairie bending under it, and the grass flattening, and the frozen ground vibrating with the impact of millions of pounds of cold air slamming into the earth at 30, then 40, then 50 miles an hour. The temperature dropped so fast that the air inside the trench contracted. Calla felt her ears pop. The canvas under the sod roof flexed inward as the pressure changed, then tightened as the wind pressed down on the sod above it. The cedar poles creaked. One of them shifted a quarter inch, and a trickle of loose earth fell from the ceiling onto Calla's blanket. She lay still and listened. The wind was not steady. It came in waves, a sustained roar punctuated by gusts that hit harder, gusts that found edges and seams and tested them. Each gust was a hand pressing down on the roof, pressing in on the walls, pressing into the entrance gap and the vent hole, looking for a way inside. The roof held because it was flush. The wind could not get under it. There was no edge to catch, no overhang to lift, no gap to pry. The sod absorbed the pressure, and the poles beneath it flexed, but did not break. The first complication came within the hour. The rear vent choked. Blown snow packed into the stovepipe opening and froze there, sealing the vent shut. Calla did not notice immediately because the wind noise covered the change in draft. She noticed when the air inside the trench began to taste different, thicker, flatter, with a faint sweetness that meant the coals in the Dutch oven were producing gas that was not leaving. Merritt's lesson fired in her mind like a match struck in dark. She grabbed the shovel handle and crawled to the rear wall. The vent was a dark circle of frozen snow. She jabbed the handle into it and felt resistance. The snow was packed, not loose. She jabbed harder. The handle punched through, and a blast of cold air screamed into the trench, carrying snow crystals that stung her face like thrown sand. The sod plug for the vent was still in place inside the pipe, but it had been pushed inward by the snow. Calla pulled it out, cleared the pipe with the shovel handle, and reinserted the plug loosely, tight enough to slow the wind, loose enough to let air exchange. The draft resumed. The thick sweetness in the air thinned. She crawled back to her blankets and lay down. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. From the knowledge that she had been minutes from sleeping and not waking up, and that the only thing between her and that sleep had been a dead buffalo hunter's lesson about breath. The second complication came 2 hours later. She heard a voice. It was faint under the wind roar. A human sound, high-pitched, rhythmic, the sound of someone shouting a word over and over. Calla pressed her ear against the sod wall of the entrance. The sound came again. Closer. A name being shouted, or a word that might have been hello, broken by wind into syllables that no longer sounded like language. She did not want to open the entrance. Merritt had told her not to open it for anything less than the vent choking. But the voice was real, and the voice was close, and a person in the open during this storm would be dead within the hour. Calla pulled the sod plug from the entrance. The wind hit her like a wall of cold water. Snow drove horizontally through the gap, coating her face, filling her mouth when she gasped. She could see nothing. The night was absolute. No moon, no stars, no horizon, no distinction between sky and ground. The world had been erased by wind and snow and dark. She shouted. The wind took her voice and shredded it. She shouted again. A sound came back. Not words. A moan. Close. Maybe 20 feet, maybe 10, somewhere between the trench and the remains of the stripped cabin. Calla grabbed the rope she had used to haul cedar poles. She tied one end to the stake Merritt had driven into the trench wall as a gear anchor. She looped the other end around her waist. Then she crawled out of the trench into the storm. If you're as invested in this story as we think you are, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next few minutes will determine whether anyone survives this night. The cold was not a temperature, it was a force. It pressed against her skin through her clothes, through her blanket, through the canvas she had wrapped around her shoulders. It found the gaps between fabric and flesh and poured through them like water through cracks in a dam. Her face went numb within seconds. Her fingers, already raw from days of digging, stopped sending messages to her brain. She crawled on her elbows, following the sound, keeping the rope taut behind her. She found him 10 feet from the trench entrance. He was on his hands and knees, facing the wrong direction, crawling toward the open prairie. He was young. She could tell by the size of his hands and the pitch of his voice when he moaned. She grabbed the back of his coat and pulled. He did not resist. He did not help. He was beyond helping. Calla dragged him back along the rope, hand over hand, pulling the boy's weight against the wind. The rope bit into her waist. The cold bit into everything. She found the entrance by feel, the slight depression, the gap in the sod, and pushed the boy down into it head first, then crawled in after him and pulled the sod plug back into place with hands that no longer felt like hands. The boy was Whit Cates, Nora Bell's younger brother. 17 years old, thin as a fence rail, sent by Nora Bell to check on the stripped cabin because Nora Bell could not stop checking on things she had already decided were hopeless. He had reached the cabin and found it drifted half full of snow and roofless in the wind, and he had turned to ride back, but his horse had spooked and thrown him and run, and he had walked in circles in the dark until his legs stopped working and he had dropped to his knees and started crawling. He was alive because Calla had opened the entrance against Merritt's instruction. He was alive because a rope tied to a stake had given her a path back. He was alive because a widow with a trench and a stone wall and a sod roof had done the one thing that every reasonable person on the Panhandle had said could not be done. She had built a shelter that worked. Inside the trench, the storm became a siege. Calla pulled Whit close to the stone wall. His clothes were soaked with snow that was melting from his body heat, which meant his body heat was leaving him through the water, which meant he was dying the slow death of a wet man in cold air. She stripped his coat and boots and wrapped him in both blankets, pressing him against the stones. The stones were not hot. They were not even warm in any way that a person would notice on a summer day, but they were warmer than the air outside, warmer than Whit's skin, and the difference, 5 degrees, maybe 8 span, was the difference between a body that could warm itself and a body that could not. she fed the coals in the Dutch oven. She had a small supply of cedar bark and twisted grass for fuel, enough for 2 days if she burned sparingly. The coals glowed and pushed heat into the trench. Not much, but enough to keep the air above freezing near the oven. The trench was 4.5 feet deep and 8 feet long. The volume of air inside it was small enough that even a coal pan and 28 sun-warmed stones and 2 human bodies could hold the temperature above the point where flesh died. The wind screamed above the roof. The sod flexed. Snow found the seams between sod blocks and sifted through in fine white threads that accumulated on the floor like flour from a torn sack. Calla swept the snow toward the drain notch with her hand every 30 minutes. The drain worked. Meltwater and swept snow trickled toward the south end and seeped into the packed earth. She kept Whit awake by making him count. "Count the roof poles," she said. "6," he said. His teeth chattered so hard the word came out in pieces. "Count the stones on the wall." "I can't see them." "Feel them. Start at the entrance end. Count with your fingers." He counted. 28. It took him 15 minutes because his fingers were swollen and clumsy, and he lost count twice and had to start over. Calla made him start over because counting was work, and work kept blood moving, and blood moving kept organs alive, and organs alive kept a boy breathing through a night that was trying to stop him. At some point, she did not know when, because time had become meaningless inside the trench, measured only in vent checks and coal feedings and snow sweepings. The wind shifted. It did not lessen. It changed direction, swinging from due north to northwest, which meant the entrance angle was less protected than before. Wind forced snow through the sod plug in the entrance. Calla packed the plug tighter with handfuls of frozen earth and pressed her body against it as a seal. She could feel the temperature inside the trench dropping. The stones were losing their stored heat. They had collected 3 hours of weak winter sun and were now spending it, degree by degree, into the air around Whit's body. By dawn, the stones would be cold. By dawn, the coals would be low. By dawn, the only heat in the trench would be what 2 human bodies could produce. And one of those bodies was a 17-year-old boy who had been crawling in a blizzard. The roof held. The poles creaked, and the canvas beneath the sod stretched, and one of the willow bundles snapped with a sound like a knuckle cracking, but the roof held. The wind could not find an edge. The sod was heavy and flat, and the wind passed over it the way the wind passed over every low hump on the prairie, unseeing, uncaring, unable to grip what it could not lift. Miles to the east, Merritt Voss was in trouble. He had left the line camp when the front hit, trying to reach the swale before the worst of it. The mule had balked at the first heavy gust, planting her hooves and refusing to face the wind. Merritt had tried to lead her. The snow came horizontal, dense as thrown sand, and he lost the horizon within minutes. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading plains terrain, and the storm erased every landmark he knew. His horse, he had traded the mule at the camp for a rancher's spare mount, went down in a washout. The horse stepped into a snow-hidden cut, its foreleg buckled, and Merritt went over its head into the drift. He landed on his shoulder and felt something shift in his collarbone. Not a break, but a wrongness. A joint that had moved where it should not have moved. The horse scrambled up and ran. Merritt did not try to follow. He was alone, on foot, in a norther that would kill him in 2 hours. He did what he had spent his life teaching himself to do. He read the ground. He found a cedar brake, a low thicket of twisted trees growing in a shallow draw, and he cut into the snow on the lee side of the thickest trunk. He packed snow around himself like a wall, leaving a gap for his face. He pulled his coat over his head and pressed his body into the smallest shape it could hold. He survived the way the trench survived, by being low, by being out of the wind, by holding the heat his body made instead of letting the air steal it. The principle was the same. Earth blocks wind. Low profiles shed force. Warmth held close lasts longer than warmth exposed. He thought about Calla. He thought about the vent. He thought about whether she would remember to punch it clear. Dawn came as a change in the quality of darkness rather than the arrival of light. The wind had not stopped. It had slowed from a scream to a moan, from 50 miles an hour to 20, from horizontal snow to swirling snow to a fine, bitter grit that hung in the air like dust. The temperature had not risen. The cold was settled now, locked into the ground, into the air, into every surface and every breath. On the ranches, the damage was becoming visible. Cattle lay dead along the drift fences, animals that had turned south with the wind and walked until they hit wire and pressed against it and frozen there, standing at first, then kneeling, then lying down in rows along the fence line like a congregation that had knelt to pray and never risen. Vane's ranch house had survived, but the windows on the north side had cracked from the pressure change, and the stove had backdrafted twice, filling the house with smoke. 2 of his riders had been caught in the open checking fence and had not come back. One would be found alive in a creek bed 2 days later. The other would not be found until March. The stripped cabin was gone, not collapsed, gone. The wind had pushed the weakened frame off its footings and scattered the boards across the prairie. The stove sat in the open like an altar in a destroyed church, half buried in drift, useless and cold. Vane's riders found the cabin site first. They expected to find a body near it. The widow who had been too stubborn to leave, frozen in her blankets beside the stove that could not warm her. They did not find a body. They found scattered boards and boot prints that led to the swale and disappeared under snow. They reported to Vane that the widow was dead, buried in her trench. Merritt Voss arrived at the swale 3 hours after dawn. He came from the east, limping, his shoulder held against his body with his belt looped around his arm. He had walked 7 miles through the aftermath of the storm, following the breaks west, and he came over the edge of the swale expecting the worst. The trench was invisible. The roof was buried under 8 inches of drift, flush with the prairie, indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. The entrance was sealed with packed snow. The vent pipe jutted from the sod with a cap of ice on its opening. Merritt knelt at the vent and listened. He heard breathing. He dug the entrance clear with his one good hand, pulling snow and frozen sod away from the gap until he could see the plug. He pulled the plug out. Warm air, warm only by comparison to the killing cold outside, maybe 35 degrees on Cisar, exhaled from the trench like breath from a sleeping animal. Calla was inside. She was lying against the stone wall with Whitcates pressed against her, both of them wrapped in blankets that were damp with condensation and body heat. The coals in the Dutch oven were gray and barely alive. The stones on the wall were cold to the touch. Everything that had stored heat had spent it through the night, degree by degree, keeping the air inside the trench above the point where 2 people would stop breathing. Calla's hair was frozen where it had touched the entrance wall. Her lips were cracked, and her hands were swollen, and her eyes, when she opened them, were the eyes of a person who has spent a night listening to the wind try to kill her and has not slept because sleeping meant not checking the vent. She looked at Merritt. She did not smile. Smiling required energy she did not have. "The vent choked twice," she said. Her voice was a rasp, scraped raw by cold air and coal smoke and 12 hours of forced breath. "I used the shovel handle." Merritt looked at the stone wall. He looked at the vent. He looked at the roof above him, sod and canvas and brush and willow and cedar, all of it holding, all of it flat, all of it below the wind that had killed cattle and scattered cabins and buried men along the wire. He sat down on the trench floor. His shoulder ached and his feet were numb, and he had not eaten in 18 hours. But he was inside, and inside was alive, and alive was enough. The shovel handle, he said, and something in his voice that might have been laughter or might have been relief broke loose and filled the trench like warmth from a stone that had been sitting in the sun. Storm broke on the second morning. The wind did not stop. Wind on the Panhandle never stopped completely, but it dropped from a killing force to a steady pressure, and the snow settled from horizontal sheets to a fine falling grit that accumulated on surfaces instead of stripping them. The sky stayed gray. The temperature stayed low. But the worst had passed, and the passing left behind a landscape that looked like it had been scrubbed with a wire brush and left to bleed. Calla crawled out of the trench, stood in the swale, and vomited. She had not eaten in 20 hours, and the vomit was bile and water, and the taste of coal smoke that had lived in her throat since the vent choked the first time. She wiped her mouth with the back of a hand she could barely feel and looked at the world the storm had made. Whit Cates told Nora Bell first. He told her because she was his sister and because she had sent him to check the cabin and because the telling was the only way he could make her understand what had happened. He sat at her kitchen table with his feet wrapped in rags and his fingers swollen to the size of sausages, and he told her that the cabin was gone and that he had crawled in the dark and that a hand had grabbed his coat and pulled him into a hole in the ground and that the hole had been warmer than any room he had been inside since the storm began. Nora Bell listened without interrupting. When Whit finished, she asked one question. "How warm?" "Warm enough that I could feel my feet by morning," Whit said. "Warm enough that the water in the coffee pot was not frozen. Warm enough that she had me count stones on the wall to keep me awake, and I could feel the stones with my fingers, and the stones were not cold." Nora Bell sat with that. She sat with it the way a person sits with a fact that contradicts a verdict they had delivered publicly and with confidence. She had called the trench a grave. She had told Calla that freezing underground would be slower, but not different than freezing above it. She had given beans and lard and willow rods, not because she believed the trench would work, but because giving supplies to a doomed woman was cheaper than the guilt of giving nothing. The trench had worked. Her brother was alive because it had worked. The arithmetic was simple, and the arithmetic did not care about Nora Bell's opinions. She went to the swale the next day. She brought a sack of flour, a side of salt pork, and a jar of rendered tallow. She did not bring them as charity. She brought them as payment. Payment for the life of a 17-year-old boy who would have died on the open prairie if a widow had not built a hole in the ground and crawled out of it into a norther to drag him inside by his coat. Calla was in the trench repairing the entrance. The storm had loosened the sod around the crawl gap, and she was cutting fresh blocks and fitting them into place. Her hands were wrapped in strips of flour sack because her gloves had been destroyed during the night, soaked through and frozen and torn at the seams. Merritt sat nearby with his arm in a sling made from his belt, watching Calla work and saying nothing, which was his way of saying that the work was correct. Nora Bell climbed down into the swale and set the supplies on the ground. She looked at the trench. She looked at the roof, still flush, still holding, still invisible from 10 feet away except for the vent pipe and the thin column of warmth rising from it. She looked at the stone wall through the open entrance. The stones were dry. The tilt Merritt had taught Calla, the slight inward angle that shed condensation, had kept them clear through the storm. A line of frozen drip marks ran along the base of the wall, where moisture had rolled off the stone faces and frozen on the floor. But the faces themselves were clean and dark and ready to absorb the next day's sun. "Show me how the air moves," Nora Bell said. It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was the sentence of a woman who had decided that learning was more important than being right. Calla lit a twist of dry grass and held it near the entrance. The smoke drifted inward, pulled along the trench floor toward the rear vent. Nora Bell watched the smoke travel. She watched it curl past the stone wall, picking up a slight warmth that made the smoke rise and thin, then continue to the vent pipe and exit through the gap around the sod plug. "The air comes in low and goes out high," Nora Bell said. "Warm air rises," Calla said. "The vent is at the top of the back wall. The entrance is at the bottom of the front. Cold air comes in low, warms near the stones and the coals, rises and leaves through the vent. As long as the vent is open, the air moves. As long as the air moves, you can breathe." "What if the vent blocks?" "You punch it clear with the shovel handle. If you can't clear it, you open the entrance and let the cold in. Cold is better than dead." Nora Bell heard the echo of a lesson in that last sentence, the cadence of something taught and repeated, but she did not ask where it came from. She asked about the stones instead. She asked about the slope of the floor. She asked about the south lip and the sun angle and the width of the crawl entrance. Each question was specific. Each answer was specific. The conversation was not friendship. It was the beginning of knowledge transferred between two women who had learned to respect each other through disagreement. Abel Trowbridge came 3 days after the storm. He came because Whit Cates had told a ranch hand, and the ranch hand had told a stock inspector's assistant, and the assistant had told Trowbridge. And Trowbridge had spent 3 days sitting with the fact that a woman he had told to walk to Mobeetie had survived a norther that had killed cattle and men and scattered a frame cabin across the prairie. He dismounted the gray horse at the edge of the swale and stood there for a long time, looking down at the trench the way a man looks at a word in a language he does not speak, recognizing the shape, not yet understanding the meaning. Then he climbed down. Calla was inside the trench with the south hatch open, letting the midday sun reach the stone wall. The sun was weak. Winter sun in the Panhandle was always weak, low and pale and carrying less heat than a candle at arm's length. But it hit the dark stones, and the stones absorbed it with the patience of objects that did not care whether the heat was strong or feeble, only that it existed. Trowbridge crouched at the entrance and looked in. He did not ask permission. He crawled inside. The trench was not comfortable. The ceiling was low. A tall man could not stand upright, and the floor was packed earth, and the air smelled of clay and coal smoke and the sour undertone of two people who had spent a night sweating through fear. But the air was warmer than outside. The stone wall radiated a faint detectable heat that Trowbridge could feel on his palm when he held it 6 inches from the surface. The vent drew air. The drain notch was dry. The roof showed no sag, no crack, no sign of failure under the weight of 8 inches of drift snow and the full sustained pressure of a norther wind. Trowbridge touched the stone wall. He ran his hand along the tilted faces, feeling the angle, understanding the geometry. He looked up at the south hatch and saw the angle of light entering and striking the stones. He looked at the vent pipe and watched the faint movement of air escaping through the gap around the plug. Then he sat on the trench floor and was quiet for a minute. "It was not a grave," he said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man placing words the way a mason places stones, each one tested before it was set. It was the only house on this flat that understood the wind. Calla said nothing. She did not need his validation the way she had needed his silence to stop hurting. The trench had already validated itself. The stones had already answered his verdict. But she listened because Trowbridge was not a man who admitted error lightly, and a man who admits error specifically is a man worth hearing. The low roof, he said. I told you a dugout needed posts and a proper stove and time. The low roof is what saved it. No edge for the wind, no lift. The wind went over like it goes over a hill. Yes, the north wall. I said a woman without 6 cords of wood was not wintering. The stones did what wood does. They held heat, not as much, but enough. Enough was the only thing I needed. The vent. I said underground spaces choke. The vent kept it breathing. The angle kept the wind from driving straight through. The vent almost killed me, Calla said. It choked with snow twice. I had to punch it clear with the shovel handle in the dark, while the wind was trying to pull the plug out of my hand. Trowbridge looked at the shovel, leaning against the trench wall with its cracked handle and re-wrapped rawhide grip. He looked at it the way a soldier looks at a weapon that has been used in a fight he was not present for. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe me nothing. You told me what you knew. You were wrong about part of it. But you were not wrong about the danger. You were not wrong that a proper dugout is better than this. You were not wrong that I needed more than I had. I just used what I had differently than you expected. Trowbridge crawled out of the trench and stood in the swale. He took a leather-bound notebook from his coat, the notebook he used for stock inspections, for recording brands and counts and conditions, and he opened it to a blank page and began to sketch. He drew the trench, the south lip, the stone wall, the vent pipe, the entrance angle. He drew them carefully, with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years recording what he saw, and when he finished, he closed the notebook and put it back in his coat. I will be showing this to people, he said. It was not praise. It was something larger than praise. It was an authority figure deciding that what he had seen was worth carrying forward. The community came next, and they came with need. Not all of them. Not quickly. The Panhandle was not a place where people rushed toward new ideas. They came in ones and twos over the following weeks, riding to the swale with questions that they disguised as curiosity and curiosity that they disguised as skepticism, because admitting that a widowed woman had solved a problem they had not solved required more humility than most of them could muster in a single visit. A rancher named Fossey came first. He had lost 11 head of cattle along the drift fence, and 2 of his line camps had been damaged. He wanted to know if the trench design could be adapted for cattle, a long, shallow shelter dug on the lee side of a rise where stock could crowd below the wind during a norther. Calla told him the principles: low roof, flush with the grade, entrance away from the prevailing wind, ventilation at the back. She told him cattle shelters did not need stone walls because cattle generated their own heat in numbers, but the roof had to be strong enough to hold the weight of snow and the pressure of animals leaning against it. A woman named Paulina Ertz came next. She lived in a sod house 12 miles north that had survived the storm but flooded during the thaw, and she wanted to know about drainage. Calla showed her the drain notch, the shallow groove cut into the trench floor that sloped toward the south end and channeled meltwater away from the sleeping area. She showed her how the sod blocks along the base of the walls were set with a finger-width gap at the bottom to allow seepage to drain instead of pooling. Abel Trowbridge's nephew came. His name was Rowan Tate, 24 years old, a carpenter who had come to the Panhandle to build ranch structures, and had found that the Panhandle did not need carpenters so much as it needed people willing to dig. Rowan looked at the trench roof with the eye of a man who understood spans and loads. He said the cedar poles were undersized for the width. Calla said she knew that, but undersized poles that existed were better than proper beams that did not. Rowan said nothing for a moment, then asked if he could build a better hatch frame. Calla handed him the axe. Each visitor was a small validation. Each validation shifted the weight of the community's judgment by a fraction. The phrase Widow Whitcomb's grave did not disappear. Phrases on the Panhandle had long lives, but it began to carry a different tone. People said it with a pause after, the pause where the joke used to be, now filled with the silence of people who were not sure the joke was funny anymore. Merritt Voss did not participate in the validation. He watched it from the edge of the swale, the way he watched everything, from a distance that allowed him to see without being drawn in. He was not a man who needed community recognition. He had spent 40 years outside of communities, and the skills he carried were the skills of a man who had learned to survive by watching, not by belonging. But he stayed. He stayed because the trench was not finished. The storm had proven the concept, but the concept had nearly failed twice. The vent choking, the entrance admitting wind when it should not have been opened. And Merritt knew that a method proven once in desperation was not yet a method that could be taught. It needed to be refined. The vent needed a better design. The entrance needed a wind baffle. The stone wall needed more mass. The roof needed stronger cross-bracing. He and Calla worked together through the weeks after the storm, and the work was the substance of their relationship. They did not talk about Elias. They did not talk about Merritt's years at Adobe Walls, or the herds he had seen darken the horizon and then vanish. They talked about angles and airflow and the weight of sod, and the best way to tilt a stone so it caught the most light with the least shadow. They disagreed about the entrance. Calla wanted to keep it narrow, barely wide enough for shoulders, because a narrow entrance admitted less wind and was easier to seal. Merritt wanted it wider, wide enough for a person to be dragged through without catching on the edges, because the night Calla had pulled Whitcates inside, his coat had snagged on the sawed lip, and she had lost 10 seconds freeing it, and 10 seconds in a norther was the distance between rescue and two bodies frozen in a crawl space. They argued about it for an afternoon. The argument was not heated. It was the argument of two people who respected each other's reasoning and disagreed about which risk mattered more, the risk of wind entering a wider gap, or the risk of a body blocking a narrower one during an emergency. They compromised. The entrance stayed narrow, but Calla cut the sawed lip smoother, removing the rough edges that could snag fabric. Merritt built a wind baffle, a short sawed wall set 2 feet outside the entrance, angled to break the wind before it reached the gap. The baffle was ugly and crude, and it worked. Wind that hit the baffle lost its force before reaching the entrance, the way water loses speed when it hits a rock in a creek. This was the partnership at its deepest. Two people with different knowledge solving problems that neither could solve alone. Merritt knew wind and fire and the behavior of plains weather. Calla knew stone and heat and the geometry of small spaces. Together, they built something that was more than either of them had imagined separately, and the building was the bond. And the bond was real because it was made of work and not of sentiment. Merritt left in late February to guide a supply party through the breaks after a late snow closed the river crossings. The supply party was a group of ranchers pooling resources to haul grain and wire from a depot 40 miles south, and they needed someone who knew the draws and the fords and the places where the snow would be shallow enough for wagons. Merritt took the job because he was a man who took jobs, and because the money would buy nails and a proper hatch hinge for Calla's trench, and because sitting still made his injured shoulder stiffen until the pain woke him at night. He came back 10 days later on the back of someone else's wagon, fevered and shaking. The exposure had caught up with him. The night in the snowbank, the 7-mile walk with the dislocated shoulder, the weeks of work and cold that never fully relented, his body had been spending heat it did not have, and the debt had come due. His lungs sounded like paper bags being crumpled. His skin was the color of tallow. He could not stand without the wagon sideboard to lean on. Calla brought him into the trench. She laid him on the sleeping shelf, a raised earth platform she had built along the south wall during the improvement work, and covered him with both blankets and Merritt's own coat. The stone wall held its afternoon heat. The coal pan glowed in the Dutch oven. The air was warm enough that Merritt could breathe without the rattle deepening, and that was the only comfort the trench could offer, because the trench was not a hospital and Calla was not a doctor, and what was happening to Merritt's lungs was beyond the reach of dark stones and sawed roofs. He lived for 11 days. On the third day, he taught Calla to read wind by the movement of birds instead of grass, how hawks circle differently before a front, how sparrows shelter an hour before the first gust. On the fifth day, he told her about adobe walls, not the famous fight, but the weeks before, when the hunters had dug cold rooms into the creek bank to keep hides from spoiling in the heat, and how those cold rooms had been the coolest places on the plains because the earth held its temperature against the summer the same way it held it against the winter. On the seventh day, he asked Calla to rebuild the vent with a double plug, one inner, one outer, so that snow could block the outer plug without reaching the inner, and the inner could be opened independently. She built it that afternoon while he watched from the sleeping shelf and corrected her angles by sound, listening to the air whistle through the pipe and telling her to widen or narrow by the pitch. On the ninth day, he stopped teaching and started talking. He told her things that did not have to do with wind or stone or venting. He told her that the buffalo had been the best company he had ever kept because they did not require conversation. He told her that the sound of a herd moving was like the sound of the earth breathing. He told her that he had never married because marriage required staying in one place, and the only places worth staying were the places no one else wanted, and those places were not kind to women who expected walls. On the 11th day, he said the last thing he would say that Calla would carry forward. He was propped against the stone wall. The afternoon sun was coming through the open hatch and warming the stones around his shoulders. His breath was shallow and wet, and his eyes had the glazed focus of a man looking at something that was not in the room. "Don't let them make it a trick," he said. "A trick is something a person does once and people clap. Make them learn the reason. The reason is what they carry. The trick they forget." He died the next morning. The stone wall was warm from the night's stored heat, and Merritt's skin was cold, and the difference between those two temperatures was the measure of what the trench could save and what it could not. Calla buried him in the breaks, in a draw where the cedar grew thick and the wind could not reach the ground. She marked the grave with a dark river stone, the same kind of stone that lined the trench wall, and she did not say words over it because Merritt had not been a man who trusted words, and the stone said what needed to be said. She walked back to the swale alone. The trench was quiet. The coal pan needed feeding, the vent needed checking, the stones needed the sun, and the sun was already low, and the work of staying alive did not pause for grief. She fed the coals. She checked the vent. She opened the south hatch and let the light fall on the stones, and the stones did what they always did. They absorbed the warmth with patience, holding it against the night that was coming, giving it back slowly, steadily, without being asked. The secondary crisis came in April. Spring on the Panhandle did not arrive gently. It came as a series of arguments between the cold that was leaving and the warmth that was arriving, and the arguments produced weather that was more violent than winter because it was contradictory. Hail in the morning, heat in the afternoon, a sky that could not decide whether to freeze or to melt, and so did both, simultaneously, with force. The hailstorm hit on a Wednesday afternoon. Stones the size of walnuts hammered the prairie for 20 minutes, stripping the new grass and pounding the sod roofs of every dugout and shelter within 30 miles. Calla's trench took the hail on its flush roof and held. The sod absorbed the impact the way packed earth absorbs a thrown stone, with a thud and a shudder, but no collapse. The canvas beneath the sod tore in one place where a hailstone found a gap between sod blocks, and Calla patched it with lard-rubbed cloth while the hail still fell. The danger came after the hail. The hailstones melted. The melt joined the snow melt that was already moving through the draws and swales, and the water rose. The shallow drain notch in Calla's trench handled the first hour of seepage, water trickling along the groove and out through the south end, but the water kept coming. The swale was a natural low point, and water from the surrounding prairie drained toward it the way water always drains toward the lowest ground. Calla's trench was at risk, but Calla's trench had Merritt's drainage lesson built into its floor and walls. The seepage was manageable. She cut a deeper channel from the drain notch to the swale's south edge, and the water followed the channel and left. Nora Bell's family was not as fortunate. Nora Bell and Whit and their mother had moved into a modified dugout 3 miles northeast, a shelter built using principles Calla had shared, but built quickly and without the drainage features that Calla had learned from Merritt. The dugout's floor was flat. The walls had no seepage gaps. The roof was sound, but the floor had become a basin, and the basin was filling. Whit came running. He was 17, and he ran the way 17-year-old boys run when their mother is standing in 8 inches of water in an underground room, and the water is rising, and the walls are clay, and clay turns soft when it is wet. Calla grabbed the shovel, the same cracked, rawhide-wrapped shovel that had built the trench and cleared the vent and dug Merritt's grave, and followed Whit at a run. If this story reminds you that the people who prepare are the people who survive, share it with someone who needs to hear that. Because what Calla does next is something she learned from a man who is no longer alive to do it himself. Nora Bell's dugout was flooding from below, not above. The water table had risen with the melt and was seeping through the flat clay floor in a dozen places, turning the packed earth into mud. The walls were softening. A section of the east wall had begun to bulge inward, pushed by the weight of saturated earth behind it. Calla assessed the way Merritt would have assessed, by looking at the water and asking where it wanted to go. Water wanted to go down and out. The dugout floor was flat, so the water had nowhere to go. The fix was the same fix she had built into her own trench, a drain channel cut through the floor to the lowest wall, and a spill channel cut through that wall to the outside. She dug. Whit dug. Nora Bell pulled her mother out of the dugout and sat her on the prairie in a blanket and came back and dug. 3 women and a boy with 2 shovels in their hands, cutting a channel through wet clay while the walls softened and the water rose. The east wall collapsed at the halfway point. It folded inward with a sound like a wet sack dropping, and a wave of mud and water surged across the floor and filled the half-dug channel. Calla stepped back, looked at the collapse, and made a decision. She did not try to rebuild the wall. She let it fall. The collapse opened a gap to the outside, and the gap became a drain, and the water that had been filling the dugout began to pour through the gap and down the slope of the prairie. It was not elegant. It was not the careful, tilted, channeled drainage that Merritt had taught. It was a controlled demolition, letting the weakest wall fail so the water had somewhere to go, and it worked because Calla understood the principle beneath the technique. Water wants to move. Give it a path, and it will take it. Block the path, and it will make its own path will be worse than anything you could have dug. Nora Bell's dugout was damaged but salvageable. The east wall would need to be rebuilt with better drainage. The floor would need to be sloped. The whole structure would need the features that Calla's trench had from the beginning, the features that Merritt had taught and Calla had built, and the community was only now beginning to understand. Nora Bell stood in the mud outside her dugout and looked at Calla with the expression of a woman who has been saved twice by the same person and is recalculating everything she thought she knew about who is capable and who is not. "You're going to teach me to build this properly," Nora Bell said. It was not a question. "Yes," Calla said, "and you are going to teach me why, not just how." Calla heard Merritt's voice in that sentence. The distinction between the trick and the reason, the difference between showing a person what to do and making them understand why it works. "Yes," she said, "that is the part that matters." Roland Vane did not come to the swale after the flood. He sent a message instead. The message came through Strunk, who rode to the supply point at Mobiati and told anyone who would listen that Calla Whitcomb was encouraging settlement on lease land, that her trench shelters were attracting squatters to the breaks, and that the digging and water channeling she had done on Nora Bell's property constituted destruction of rangeland. The accusation was absurd, but it was not without teeth. The Panhandle's fence conflicts had made every act of digging and building a political statement. Ranchers who enclosed state lands with wire had spent years arguing that their fences were improvements, not enclosures. Settlers who cut fences to reach water or grass had spent years arguing that the fences were illegal barriers. The state legislature had passed fence-cutting laws and then investigated illegal enclosure, and the whole mess had left the Panhandle in a state of legal confusion where a man with a good lawyer and a loud voice could turn any act of construction into an act of trespass. Vane had a good lawyer and the loudest voice in the county. He wanted Calla's Trench declared an illegal improvement on lease land, his lease land, the land her dead husband's cabin had stood on. If the trench was an improvement, then the improvement belonged to the leaseholder, and the leaseholder could order it filled. If Calla refused, she was trespassing on improved land, and trespass was a matter for the county. The threat was real. The threat was also desperate. Vane had lost cattle in the storm, over 100 head piled against his drift fence, frozen in rows along the wire. His ranch house had lost its north-facing windows, and 2 of his riders had needed a week to recover from exposure. The big die-up was reshaping the cattle business across the Panhandle, and men who had measured their worth in head counts were discovering that the wire that held their cattle was also the wire that killed them. Vane's power was shrinking, but a shrinking man with legal leverage was still dangerous, and Calla Whitcomb, who had no husband, no lawyer, and no money beyond the $3 remaining from her original 9, was exactly the kind of person a shrinking man could crush to remind himself that he was still large. The threat hung over the swale like the front edge of another storm. Summer changed the Panhandle the way summer always changed it, suddenly, completely, and without apology. The cold that had killed cattle and cracked window glass and frozen men along fence lines retreated north, and the heat took its place with the same indifference. The grass came back. The draws ran with snowmelt. The prairie, which had looked dead for 4 months, turned green in a week, and the green was so vivid against the brown that it hurt the eyes. Calla's Trench stayed cool. This was the detail that surprised people more than the warmth had. They had accepted reluctantly that an underground shelter with stone walls and a sod roof could hold heat in winter. They had seen the proof in Whitcate's surviving fingers and in Calla's unbroken body, and in the cattle shelter Fossey had dug on the lee side of his north pasture that had saved a dozen head during the late March blow. But the idea that the same trench could stay cool when the surface temperature climbed past 90 degrees, that was something they had not considered. Calla had considered it because Merritt had told her about the buffalo hunters' cold rooms near adobe walls. The earth held its temperature against the heat the same way it held it against the cold. 4 feet below the surface, the ground stayed close to the annual average. cool in summer, warm in winter, and a shelter dug into that depth and roofed with sod existed in a different climate than the one raging above it. The dark stones that absorbed winter sun and released it as warmth now absorbed summer shade and released it as coolness. The physics did not change. The earth did not take sides. By midsummer, Calla had built a second shelter. This one was larger, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, 5 feet deep, with a stone-lined north wall, a proper sleeping shelf, a double-plug vent, a wind-baffled entrance, and a drainage channel that ran the full length of the floor and exited through a clay pipe at the south end. It was not a trench anymore. It was a room. Calla called it a low room because the name described what it was. A room built low, below the wind, below the weather, below the notice of anyone who did not know where to look. She built it for Nora Bell's family. The building took 3 weeks, and it was the first time Calla taught the full process from beginning to end. Nora Bell dug. Whit hauled stones from the breaks. Their mother, a thin woman named Dorsey Cates, who had survived the flood standing in 8 inches of water and had not complained once, cut sod blocks with a strength that contradicted her frame. Calla directed, corrected, explained. She showed Nora Bell how to test stone color. Darker stones absorbed more heat. Lighter stones reflected it. She showed Whit how to tilt the stones and check the angle by shadow. She showed Dorsey how to pack sod blocks with a twist that locked them together the way bricks lock in a wall. The teaching was not charity. It was Merritt's last instruction made real. Don't let them make it a trick. Make them learn the reason. Calla taught the reason for every step. The south lip was low because low lips admitted sun without catching wind. The vent was at the top of the north wall because warm air rose and needed to exit above the level where people breathed. The floor sloped because water followed gravity, and gravity did not negotiate. Each reason was simple. Each reason was the kind of knowledge that a person could carry in their head and apply without Calla present, and that was the point. The knowledge had to survive the teacher, the way Merritt's knowledge had survived Merritt. Vane's legal threat moved slowly through the summer, the way legal threats move in places where the nearest court sits in a town that takes 2 days to reach. His lawyer filed a complaint with the county. The county acknowledged the complaint and did nothing because the county had larger concerns. The big die-up had destroyed a third of the cattle wealth in the Panhandle, and the men who had accumulated that wealth through grass leases and drift fences were suddenly less powerful than they had been 6 months earlier. Fences that had defined property were now fences that had killed stock. Leases that had granted control were now leases that carried the stain of loss. The political landscape was shifting, and Vane was standing on ground that was moving beneath him. He did not know it yet, or he knew it and refused to adjust, which amounted to the same thing. Through the fall, Calla continued building and teaching. She helped Fosse improve his cattle shelter with a stone-lined warming wall. She advised a family named Kirchner on siting a low room beside their sod house, a storm shelter they could reach in minutes when the sky changed color. She showed Abel Trowbridge how to add the trench design to his stock inspection reports as a recommended emergency shelter, and Trowbridge carried those reports across 3 counties, and the reports carried Calla's design with them. Rowan Tate kept coming to the swale. He came because the hatch frame he had built in March needed adjustment. The wood had swelled with spring moisture, and the hatch no longer seated flush. And because the adjustment took an hour, but Rowan stayed for 3, and then he came back the next week to check the adjustment. And the check took 10 minutes, but Rowan stayed for 4 hours, and by the 4th visit, neither of them pretended the hatch was the reason. Rowan was not a man who spoke about feelings the way some men spoke about weather, constantly, loudly, and without useful precision. He was a man who expressed himself through the quality of his work and the direction of his attention, and his attention was directed at Calla with a steadiness that was impossible to misread. Their courtship, if it could be called that, took place entirely through labor. Rowan arrived one morning with a wagon load of cedar posts, proper posts, milled at a camp near the breaks. The kind of posts Strunk had refused to sell Calla in January. He unloaded them at the swale without being asked and said, "Your roof poles are undersized. I brought replacements." "Those cost money," Calla said. "They cost me a week of carpentry work at Fosse's ranch. Fosse paid in posts because he has no cash. I have no use for posts." "You have use for posts. This is not complicated." Calla looked at the posts. They were straight and clean, and thick enough to span the trench width without the flex that had kept her awake during the storm, listening for the sound of cedar cracking under snow load. She looked at Rowan. He was standing beside the wagon with his hands in his pockets, looking at the trench the way he always looked at structures, with the eye of a man who saw what was wrong and wanted to fix it, not because the wrongness offended him, but because fixing things was how he understood the world. "Where does the next roof frame go?" Calla asked. Rowan looked at the trench, and then at the second low room she had built for Nora Bell, and then at the cut bank where the dark stones caught the autumn sun. "Where do you want it?" he said. They built it together. Rowan brought his tools to the swale the way a man brings his tools to a place where he intends to stay. He did not move in. He did not propose. He built a proper hatch with iron hinges scavenged from a wrecked wagon, and he replaced the roof poles, and he framed a storage shelf into the trench wall, and he was there in the morning, and he was there in the evening, and the trench had become a place that held two people's work instead of one. The partnership was not romance in any sense that a town would recognize. There were no flowers, no dances, no promises spoken in a church. There was Rowan saying, "The cross brace needs a shim," and Calla saying, "Use the cedar offcut. The grain is tighter," and the two of them working in a silence that was not empty, but full. Full of the kind of understanding that comes from watching another person solve problems and recognizing that they solve them well. The second winter came in November. It did not come as savagely as the first. The Panhandle did not produce a January norther of the same killing intensity as the one that had driven the big die-up, though the cold was deep and the wind was constant, and the drift fences, the ones that still stood, the ones that the legislature had not yet forced down, still trapped cattle when the storms drove them south. But this winter was different because the people were different. 7 families along the Canadian River breaks had some version of Calla's low room. Not all of them were well built. Not all of them had stone walls or proper vents or drainage channels. Some were crude trenches with brush roofs, barely better than lying in a ditch. But they were below the wind. They were below the surface. And when the first hard norther blew through in December, the families who had low rooms slept through it, and the families who did not spend the night feeding stoves and stuffing rags into window gaps and listening to the sound of wind testing every seam in their walls. Fosse's cattle shelter saved 23 head during the December storm. He counted them in the morning, standing in the shelter's entrance, and the number, always 23, became a fact that traveled across the county faster than any legal complaint Vane's lawyer could file. Trowbridge showed the shelter designs at a stock inspectors meeting in Mobeetie. He opened his notebook and showed the sketches, the ones he had drawn at Calla's swale in January, and he explained the principles the way Calla had explained them to him. Low roof, stone wall, vent, drainage, south-facing entrance. The inspectors listened because Trowbridge was a man whose word had weight, and his word was that a widow with $9 and a cracked shovel had built a shelter that outperformed every frame house on the flats. The third norther of the second winter came in late January. It was not as cold as the first winter's storm, but it was long 3 days of sustained wind and snow that pinned people indoors and froze water in barrels and turned the prairie white from horizon to horizon. Roland Vane did not build a low room. He did not modify his ranch house. He did not ask Fosse about the cattle shelter or Trowbridge about the sketches or anyone about anything, because asking would have meant admitting that a woman he had evicted and a method he had dismissed were worth his attention, and Roland Vane's attention was reserved for things that confirmed his judgment, not things that contradicted it. His foreman, Strunk, was caught in the open. Strunk had ridden out to check the drift fence on the second day of the storm, against the advice of every man at the ranch, because Vane had ordered the fence checked, and Strunk was a man who followed orders the way a dog follows a whistle, without thought and without delay. The storm pinned him 2 miles from the ranch house and 6 miles from the nearest line camp. His horse refused to face the wind. Strunk dismounted and led the horse by the bridle, walking blind through horizontal snow, and the horse pulled free and ran, and Strunk was alone. He found Nora Bell's low room by accident. He was walking south, the wind at his back pushing him the only direction it would allow, and he stumbled into the swale where Nora Bell's rebuilt shelter sat flush with the prairie, invisible under drift except for the vent pipe, which Strunk's boot hit in the dark. Nora Bell heard the impact. She heard Strunk fall. She opened the entrance and pulled him inside the way Calla had pulled Whit inside a year earlier, by the back of his coat, through a gap barely wide enough for shoulders, into a space that was warmer than the world above it. Strunk lived because of a shelter built by the woman whose stovepipe he had pulled from her cabin roof. He did not appreciate the irony. He appreciated the warmth. The distinction between those two responses was the distinction between Strunk and the story he had become part of. Vane came to the swale 4 days after the storm broke. He did not send riders. He did not send paper. He came himself, on a horse that was too thin and a saddle that was too fine, and he dismounted at the edge of the swale and stood looking down at the low rooms, Calla's original trench, the expanded shelter, the second room she had built for Nora Bell, the way a man looks at a city that has grown where he expected to find empty ground. Calla was repairing the wind baffle. The storm had shifted one of the sod blocks, and she was cutting a replacement, shaping it with the same cracked shovel she had used since the beginning, the handle now wrapped so many times with rawhide that the original wood was invisible. Vane climbed down into the swale. "Your dirt house kept my foreman breathing," he said. Calla did not look up from the sod block she was cutting. She pressed the shovel blade into the frozen earth and levered a clean rectangle free. She fitted it into the baffle gap and tamped it with her boot. "The dirt did what it always does," she said. "You just stopped standing above it." Vane stood with that sentence the way a man stands with a slap, absorbing the sting, deciding whether to return it. He did not return it. He did not have the standing to return it, because his foreman was alive and his cattle were dead, and his drift fence was a graveyard, and his ranch house had lost its north windows again, and a year of legal threats and supply refusals and boot prints on south lips had produced nothing except the proof that he had been wrong about everything. He did not apologize. Apology was not in the vocabulary of men like Vane, men who had built their lives on the assumption that money and control were the same thing, and that both could substitute for understanding. He turned and climbed out of the swale and rode north without speaking again, but he did not file the legal complaint. The complaint died on a lawyer's desk in a town 2 days' ride away, and the lawyer did not pursue it because the lawyer had heard about the shelters and about the cattle saved, and about the widow who had survived a norther in a trench, and even lawyers understood when a case had become unwinnable. Vane's fences came down the following year. Not all of them, some remained legal and useful, marking boundaries that made sense. But the drift fences, the long wire walls that ran east-west across the open range and trapped cattle against them during storms. Those came down, pulled by court order and public anger, and the accumulated weight of dead animals and dead men along their lines. Vane sold his lease the year after that. He moved east. The spring that had been worth a widow's eviction passed into the hands of a family that watered cattle from it and never thought about the man who had fought to control it. The years compressed the way years do when the drama is over and the living begins. Calla and Rowan married in the spring of the third year. The ceremony was brief and held at the Swale, which was no longer a single trench, but a cluster of low rooms and storage shelters, and a surface cabin that Rowan had built with cedar from the breaks and stone from the cut bank. The cabin had a stove and a stovepipe, a new one, bought with money earned from Rowan's carpentry and Calla's consulting, which was not called consulting because the word did not exist on the Panhandle, but which amounted to the same thing. People paid her in flour, posts, labor, and occasionally coin to come to their land and tell them where to dig and how deep and which direction to face the stones. They had a daughter in the fourth year. They named her Dorsey, after Nora Bell's mother, who had stood in 8 inches of floodwater without complaint and cut sod blocks with the strength of a woman half her age. The name was a debt paid, and paying it felt right. Calla taught through the years the way Merritt had taught, through action, through demonstration, through the patience of a person who understood that knowledge transferred by hand lasted longer than knowledge transferred by mouth. She showed women how to test stone. She showed men how to read wind. She showed children how to check a vent by holding a grass stem near the pipe and watching which way the smoke bent. She never wrote the method down. She carried it the way her father had carried his knowledge of stone, in her hands, in her eyes, in the way she pressed her palm against a wall and knew whether the mortar was cured, whether the heat was holding, whether the earth behind the stone was wet or dry. Trowbridge carried the sketches. His inspection notebooks traveled across 3 counties over a decade, and the low-room design traveled with them, adapted and modified and sometimes butchered by people who understood the shape but not the reason. When Calla heard about a shelter that had been built without a vent, or with the entrance facing north, or with light-colored stones that reflected heat instead of absorbing it, she would visit and correct, and the correction was always the same. She would explain the reason. The reason was what people carried, the trick they forgot. Nora Bell became the second teacher. She taught women in settlements east of the breaks how to build emergency storm rooms, small, crude, effective shelters that could be dug in a day and occupied in an hour, and that would keep a family alive through a norther when the cabin stovepipe failed or the walls gave way. She taught with the same specific, practical directness that she brought to everything, and she always started the same way. A woman I know built one of these with a cracked shovel and $9. You have more than she did, so you have no excuse. The low rooms spread the way useful things spread on the frontier. Not through advertisement or authority, but through survival. A family built one and lived through a storm. Their neighbor saw and built one. The neighbor's cousin visited and asked questions. The questions traveled with the cousin to the next county. The answers followed, carried in notebooks and memories, and the hands of people who had learned by digging. By the 5th winter, Calla counted 14 low rooms along the Canadian River breaks. By the 7th, she stopped counting because the design had changed enough in other people's hands that she could not always tell which shelters owed their existence to her and which had been invented independently by people who had simply looked at the ground and asked the same question she had asked, "What if I built below the wind?" She did not mind. The design was not hers. It was the earth's. She had not invented anything. She had remembered a lesson from a dead stone mason and applied it with the help of a dead buffalo hunter, and the lesson and the help had been enough, because enough was always enough when a person used what they had instead of mourning what they lacked. Calla Whitcomb lived her remaining years near the Canadian River breaks. She never moved east. She never left the Panhandle. The swale where she had dug her first trench became the center of a small settlement that grew around the spring Vane had tried to claim, and the spring watered cattle and children and gardens and never once asked who owned it. She died in winter, which felt right, in the low room that Rowan had expanded over the years, until it was more house than shelter. The stone wall was warm, the vent drew air. The light came through the south hatch the way it always had, low, angled, patient, and fell on the dark stones her father had taught her to trust. Rowan found her in the morning with her hand resting on the wall, palm flat against the stone, as if she were checking the heat one last time. Within 2 winters of the first norther, 7 families along the breaks had built some version of Calla's low room. Abel Trowbridge carried the design in his inspection notebook. Norabel Cates taught women to test vents before sealing a roof. Whit Cates, who had once crawled blind across a frozen prairie and been pulled into a hole by a widow's hand, built storm shelters for 3 ranches and never charged for the first one. Calla lived out her years near the Canadian River breaks, in the swale where the wind had scoured the snow, thin, and the dark stones had held the warmth of a winter sun too weak to feel. She taught until her hands could not demonstrate, and then she taught by telling, and the telling always came back to the same instruction: learn the reason, not the trick. The reason is what survives. The night of the first norther, when the temperature made exposed skin feel dead within minutes, and cattle froze along the drift fences in rows, like a congregation kneeling, Roland Vane's men had pulled the stovepipe from Calla Whitcomb's cabin and told her the walls were not hers, and the spring was not hers, and the land was not hers. Vane had stepped on her south lip and pressed his boot into the frozen sod and said, "You cannot live under dirt and call it a house." But when the storm came and the cabin scattered and the frame houses rattled and the cattle died against the wire, the only shelter left standing on that flat was 8 feet long and 4.5 feet deep, with 28 dark stones tilted toward a sun that was not shining, and a sod roof the wind could not grip, and a woman inside who kept a boy alive by making him count the stones on the wall. Roland Vane had taken her roof. So Calla Whitcomb built a home the sky could not touch,